This is session 2 of continuation of the interactive process between the ADA and the FMLA. We are continuing on dealing with the general overview of the ADA. And as we ended up on the last podcast, we were talking about the major bodily functions that Congress did add into the idea of what are considered when we talk about major life functions, and of course we look at major life functions and whether someone is substantially limited in them to determine whether they do indeed meet the definition of the ADA. And also too, when we talk about people who do meet the definition of ADA, in addition to what we ended up with in the last session, we also look at episodic conditions. Individuals who have an impairment that is episodic or even in remission may still qualify as having a disability and therefore be entitled to ADA protection. If the individual would be disabled when the condition is active, then we consider that they are disabled. So if you have someone who is in remission due to a history of cancer, obviously when it was active, they could substantially limit a major life function, and therefore that individual would be considered disabled. That individual may also be considered as disabled because they do have that record of that disability. So they basically would meet the first and the second definition of what is a disabled individual entitled to ADA protection. One of the things that the Amendments Act did do was overturn another U.S. Supreme Court case in dealing with mitigating measures. Historically, prior to the amendments, the Supreme Court had ruled that in determining whether an impairment substantially limited a major life activity, we looked at the impairment after someone used mitigating measures. The particular case that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court dealt with two sisters who wanted to fly for a commercial airline, and they were legally blind. But with the use of eyeglasses, they were able to see quite fine. When the airline refused to hire them, they sued under the ADA, saying that the employer had discriminated against them based on the fact that they had severe myopia, which without their eyeglasses did indeed substantially limit their ability to see. The Supreme Court disagreed with them and said, no, we look at the condition with the use of your eyeglasses, and since you see fine with the use of your eyeglasses, you do not meet the definition of disability, and therefore the airline had no duty to try to accommodate you. The Congress did not like this particular decision, as well as a lot of civil rights groups, and therefore Congress did come back and amend the ADA and said that we look at conditions without the benefit of mitigating measures. And when we talk about mitigating measures, we are talking about those things that an individual may take or procedures that an individual may use to lessen the intensity or make the impairment that they have less limiting. As I said, we look at this condition without the benefit of these mitigating measures. So we look at what would the impairment be if they were not using these mitigating measures that would make their impairment less limiting. Examples that have been given, obviously if an employee has an amputated leg, you would consider whether the amputation substantially limited his ability without wearing his prosthesis. The exception that is given in the regulations is ordinary eyeglasses and contact lenses. Obviously, when we're talking about individuals who wear ordinary eyeglasses and contact lenses, that affects a huge segment of our population, and Congress was not trying to indicate that all of us have some type of a disability. Obviously, all of us usually have some type of an impairment, but we usually are able to go on with our lives without too much problem. So we are talking about obviously a lot more than just the fact that you may have less than perfect vision. When we talk about the ADA, obviously you do look at whether the employee does have a disability. Although I will say that the EEOC will jump over this particular question, and they will jump right to the interactive process and what you need to do to accommodate an impairment. And the reason why the EEOC jumps over this particular part of the analysis is that the EEOC says that when you get into the interactive process and you look at whether an impairment, what the impairment's limitations are on the employee, as part of that interactive process, you may find that it is not substantially limiting, and therefore you will not have a duty to accommodate. So the EEOC says that it's sort of a circular analysis, and they have no real problem with jumping over the aspect of what is a disability and jumping right to the interactive process. However, when we deal with court analysis, the courts will always address whether the individual does have that disability, because in large part the individual is just not entitled to protection under the statute unless they indeed are disabled as defined under the statute. But if the individual does have a disability, then you look at whether they're qualified. As I said, there's nothing written into the statute, and the courts will not require you to lower your job qualifications. The individuals must still be qualified for your job. And when we talk about qualification, being qualified for your job, that means that they must be able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodations. And of course, if they do need an accommodation, you look at whether it is reasonable and whether it would impose an undue hardship upon you. And that's all part of the interactive process that is required under the ADA. As I said, given the broad scope of the ADA, trying to focus on whether someone is actually disabled is probably not as important as the EEOC has suggested. Usually now focusing on defining those essential functions of the job, ensuring that all requests for reasonable accommodation are handled properly, and of course engaging in the interactive process in good faith with documentation. When looking at that essential functions, I do want to talk a little bit more about the interplay when we talk about essential functions with the Family and Medical Leave Act. Keep in mind that the ADA says that you are trying to provide reasonable accommodations so that that individual is able to perform the essential functions of the job. Under the Family and Medical Leave Act, however, what we're indicating is that someone, at least temporarily, is unable to perform the essential functions of their job, and therefore they need a leave of absence from your organization to deal with whatever condition that they may have that has made them unable to perform the essential functions of their job. So the goals are slightly different here. ADA, as I said, is designed to require you to provide some type of accommodation so they can perform the essential functions of the job. There's an inherent, to even qualify under FMLA, the main question you would be asking a medical profession, can they perform the essential functions of their job, and you don't look at the accommodation aspect of it. When we talk about reasonable accommodation under the ADA, the employee usually must ask for that accommodation. Employers are not required to be clairvoyant or to read employees' minds. However, if an employee does have a known disability and have obvious limitations that you may need to accommodate, you must acknowledge those and, again, go straight to the interactive process and ask them what you can do to provide those accommodations to them. If you do know that an individual has a known disability and has limitations and you don't engage in that interactive process and you take action against them, of course you may be liable for a violation under the ADA. And of course, if the employee is even unable to ask you for accommodations and you know about it, that would also be an exception to the requirement that the employee must ask you for a reasonable accommodation. When we talk about what is a reasonable accommodation, we do look at reasonableness. It is the employee's burden to identify an accommodation that would be considered reasonable. However, if you determine that it is not a reasonable accommodation, you must still look at other accommodations that may be possible that would still meet the employee's needs and that would be something that your organization would be able to do without that undue hardship, without an undue hardship upon your organization. It is impossible to give you specific examples of what is an undue hardship under the ADA because that will vary from company to company and will vary from even position to position and, of course, will vary from jury to jury. It is a jury question of what is an undue hardship upon your organization, and it is the employer's burden to prove that a suggested accommodation would be an undue hardship upon their organization. Individuals who also, because of their impairment, pose a direct threat to either their safety or the safety of others, there is no need to accommodate them unless you can remove that threat through an accommodation. With regard to the direct threat, it is the employer's burden, again, to establish that direct threat, and it is the employer's burden to establish it by referencing acceptable medical community opinions on this. It is not acceptable to make the decision that someone imposes a direct threat due to the fact that your coworkers are concerned for their safety or the like, in the absence of the medical community actually opining that that particular condition does pose a direct threat, then you are not going to meet that direct threat exception. An example of that would be if someone were HIV positive, which the medical science says is not can only be communicated through an exchange of bodily fluids, and is not an airborne condition, that individuals can safely work around individuals who are HIV positive. You would not be able to establish a direct threat exception because coworkers did not want to work around that individual because of fear that they might be contagious, because the medical science simply does not back up that fear. When we talk about reasonable accommodation, the employer does not have to choose the best or the most expensive option. There is no need to eliminate essential functions as an accommodation, but marginal functions, you are required to reassign those marginal functions to someone else if they're not essential for the particular job in question. You are not required to cause others to work harder or longer. Courts have said that that is an undue hardship, so that's one exception where I can tell you that something would likely be considered an undue hardship upon your organization when you are requiring others to work harder or longer as part of that accommodation. And, of course, if the employee rejects a reasonable accommodation, you would have no obligation at that point to continue in the interactive process. Possible accommodations would be the reassignment, job restructuring of marginal job functions, modified schedule, a leave of absence, and workplace modifications. When we talk about the interaction, we're usually looking at the modified schedule or the leave of absences, because that is also something that may be required under the Family and Medical Leave Act if someone does need that for at least up to 12 weeks because they are unable to perform the essential functions of the job. They may be requesting a modified schedule, and they may also be requesting some type of a leave of absence to deal with their condition that they have that has made them unable to perform the essential functions of their job. The interactive process here, we also look at, it is between the employer and the employee. It is to determine whether there's a reasonable accommodation, but it's also for the process of determining what limitations an impairment actually imposes upon an employee. So you're looking, when you do this interactive process, you're asking two questions: what type of limitations they have, and those limitations, what do they, what kind of, how does that limit their ability to perform a major life function? And the second part of that is whether there is a reasonable accommodation that you may be able to provide to the employee. When we talk about performance issues, it is very important that you, again, and I think I've focused on this a couple of times, you're not required to lower your job requirements, and you're not required to lower your expectations with regard to job performance. So if you have an individual who does have performance problems, instead of focusing on the issue about their disability or the like, or trying to overlook their performance problems, you have a right to address those performance problems with them. You discuss the specific essential job functions that they may not be performing successfully. You may actually invite the employee to identify steps that can help them succeed. Advise them if performance does not improve, disciplinary action will be taken for documented poor performance, and document. What you don't want to do is say, wow, you're not performing well. Does this have something to do with your medical condition? Then that's a problem. You just address your performance issues head on and again, just talk to them that they're not meeting your expectations and why, and then you can document it. But if they do tell you that they have, that there is something that you can do to help them succeed, and it is part of a reasonable accommodation, again, you would obviously want to provide that accommodation to them that would enable them to perform those essential functions of the job, and of course communicating that with the employee, and again documenting. The 4 Ds of reasonable accommodation: the dialogue, document, decide, and then deliver. We are at another break here, and the next session that we will begin taking up again the Family and Medical Leave Act.